All right, so it's end of the year video time for me, especially because as you are watching this, I am somewhere in the midst of Winds and Truth. I don't know how long this is going to take me. I don't care. I'm having a good time. It probably, when I finish it, might be a contender for best of the books that I've read in 2024. But honestly, it takes a lot of stress off my shoulders to not even have to consider it for that. It's just I'm just reading it for myself. It's a blast. I'm having a good time. So that said, I've already gone through everything I've read this year. It's less than normal, but still over 90 books. It's somewhere between 90 and 100. Who's to say? And I like to make a surprises runner-up video, and I like to make a best of. And so that's what we're going to do this week because it's my birthday week. And I like to spread the love during my birthday week. And then we will get into some of my disappointments, my DNFs, the 2024 releases I've read, series that I have finished, etc. I used to have a short story video. I didn't read enough short story collections that I really wanted to talk about to make that video. But if you really wanted to know what short story collections I've read this year, come find me in Discord or in the comments. We can chat. So this one, it's the surprises. These are the books that when I look back on them, man, I did not expect to have that kind of experience. They were maybe almost favorites, but it might be less that they became favorites and more just in the moment. I was just wow, what's going on? And so for the first part, I'm going to go through the surprises and be from least favorite to favorite of the surprises-ish, a lot of ish. I'm not very good at ranking books. And then I have 3 runner-ups that I really enjoyed this year. It's not surprising that I enjoyed them, but they're not quite in my best books of the year, Not quite. So let us begin. And I guess for the first thing I want to bring up here is I can really tell that I tried really hard to read science fiction this year because on both of my lists. They are showing up. Last year, not so much. On the downside, fantasy showing up less, and I think that's because I primarily reread most of my fantasy in 2024. I don't know, I need to do a little internal audit on that before I do goals for next year, but that's a couple weeks down the line. We're not going to get into that right now. But let's start with We Have Always Been Here. This is a book I'd had on my TBR for a really, really, really long time, and I only read it for a TBR project. I was literally having one of the worst weeks of my life when I picked up this book. A lot of people I know have given it 2.5 to 3 stars. I had very low expectations, and it's a debut. So I know nothing about the author. I knew it would be kind of a thriller sci-fi. And that is what it is. It's a psychological thriller sci-fi. It has a very prickly female character. It has a lot of tropes that I actually kind of like in that genre space, and I could not put it down. The writing style felt so good to my brain. Now, months away from it, it hasn't really stuck with me, so I can't really say it's a new favorite, but I'm happy to keep the book. I'm really happy I bought it and read it. Let's see, what is the premise of this? We're on a planet, and there are these really weird artifacts that keep happening. And our main character is the psychologist for the people on the ship. It's very closed circle mystery adjacent vibes, but she's purposely not given all the information she needs because based off the cultural world building, she is not conscripted. And so she is not given the same information as everyone else. And things start to happen. People start to have these thoughts invade their heads. We're getting flashbacks to what happened before they showed up, before this planet was discovered. And we're trying to figure out, why do we care about this planet? It's very thriller, space exploration. And I liked this prickly, kind of very paranoid main character. I liked following her. I liked seeing how she kind of dealt with her own baggage and grow a little bit. Some of the sci-fi explanations I think get a little wibbly wobbly, but kind of work in a quantum way. And so I was cool with that. So I generally just had a much better time than I anticipated. I read it in 2 to 3 days. And like I said, it helped me escape in a very dark part of my year. So go it. Next up is Elysium. This one was just surprising based off its project. I was very fascinated by this. This is a 200-page book. I read one other book by this author that I didn't really enjoy, The Destroyer of Light. And so this one, we are basically getting told a story, and every so often the story gets reconfigured. And we don't really know what the real story is because the data is corrupted. And so every time you get this reiteration, something is changed, but the bones are the same. And it's kind of a fever dream quality. And you're trying to figure out, how did we get here? And I just really enjoyed unpacking the layers and layers. And I think it was really served by being only 200 pages. If it's longer than 200 pages, I probably would have gotten really done with it really fast. It kind of has almost a mixed media-like quality with the coding, because I think the idea is this story is left in the computer cloud of the atmosphere. Like, there are these nanotech things. So this story has been kept in the atmosphere of this planet, and we are mining that to learn it. And yeah, I think it's just really creative. Like, just truly such a standout work. If you are like, I have read everything, I am so bored, try it out. It's incredibly innovative. The next one is Fledgling by Octavia Butler, because everyone does not like this book. That's not true. There are people who like this book, but a lot of times when you see people review this book, there's all the caveats about how the main character looks like she's 10 and there's sexual stuff and it gives them the ick, etc., etc. All of these things are valid. But like, you really get prepped for an uncomfortable time with this book. But this was the last Butler I had ever read. And at that point, I was able to do a video on all of Butler's works that I had read, even some of the books that weren't published when she was alive. And let's just say that this doesn't even scratch the surface of how uncomfortable I've been personally reading a Butler work. So, one, was happy that it wasn't that uncomfortable. And two, I really liked this story. You can kind of tell it is written near the end of her career, because it is like the most hopeful of her works. She tends to have a very rational, jaded view of the world when she's playing with communities and power imbalances. And this one, although has a lot of the hallmark, I'm uncomfortable, consent, question mark, stuff that Butler brings into those questions, it is, for me, one of the more hopeful endings that I've gotten to. I also really just wasn't expecting the type of story it is. It's kind of like a mystery action beginning part with the amnesia character, and then it ends up in like a court scene. Which is interesting. So yeah, in general, just really surprised by it. And for me, I wasn't as uncomfortable because I think I was expecting it to be vampires turned at 10, so they're stuck in a 10-year-old's body forever trope, and it's not. This person we're following is a completely different species from human. Her body will grow and mature, and her body is currently 50 years old, and in her culture, she has the emotional maturity of an adult who can give consent. And that's big for me. I can get past the visuals if I know all of those things. All right, next up, this was a big surprise. And not quite a favorite of the year because it didn't stick with me, but Translation State by Ann Leckie. I read the first book in the trilogy that this is in the same world of, I can't remember it now, The Empire of Rock or something like that. Ancillary Justice, is that the name of it? I can't remember, but I didn't like the first book. I really didn't. I was bored to tears. Not really to tears, but I was incredibly bored. And it was a shame because it was very cool. But I think part of it is the main character in that book was very distant, and that made sense for world building, but it didn't make it fun. And it was a revenge plot, and I'm just like, a hard sell on a revenge plot. There has to be other stuff, and the other stuff wasn't there because the character was at a distance. But this one, same world, in the future of the trilogy, I hear maybe if you've read enough of that trilogy to know characters, it might slightly spoil you. I don't think it could spoil you if you don't know any names, places, or things, because how are you going to know that that was important? But this is past that in the chronological time point of the world, and we're following 3 perspectives, and it's so character-driven, and they're kind of all different species and positions in the world, and they're learning about themselves and each other. One of them is a species that people are really scared of, and there's about to be this treaty, and I just loved focusing on these individuals, like focusing on this big global problem through these individuals was really compelling to me. I really loved it. And yeah, I just read it in a few days, and it was just like, I wasn't expecting to be that engaged because I was so bored reading the first book in a trilogy in the same world by this author. It almost made me want to go back, and I might still one day, maybe in a different headspace, because that was just so astronomically different of an experience for me. But I do think the key difference is how character-focused Translation State was. And that's just not the same thing for the first book in that trilogy, because in its nature, that character is learning to be a person. And so doesn't have a lot of personality that they're bringing to the table. Whereas here I have 3 distinct personalities with 3 distinct agendas and trials and tribulations, and I'm learning about the world, and it was just very fun. I had a really good time. I don't really know what to say about the plot other than what I did. Like I said, there's going to be a peace treaty, things are coming to a head, and these 3 individuals are somehow involved. The next is kind of more of a contemporary, but it has magical realism elements, and that's The Skin in Its Girl. I read this for the Ursula K. Le Guin Award in Fiction. And again, this was just like, I was not expecting the writing style to just like just sweep me away. It was really compelling, especially because this is really contemporary. Like, it's maybe contemporary literary. It has a very, very small magical realism elements. But I really loved the storytelling nature of this. I was just completely captivated. We have this young woman, she's in her 30s, I believe, at the gravesite of her aunt, who was a big force for the first 10 years of her life. And she's basically trying to solve for herself the problem of, should I stay or should I go? Should I stay with my family, be the aunt like you were the aunt for me, or do I follow the love of my life, which you chose to not do? And do you have regrets for that? And they're both lesbians, but with her great aunt was a lesbian, it was a little more hush-hush, sort of thing. Another part of this is there are a Palestinian family who had moved to California from Palestine in the late 20th century, and you get a lot of their history. And something I really appreciated about this work is that it still shows the cruelty and trials of just the average citizen of Palestine and what it means to, no longer have a right to go home, how they're treated when they do go home, how they form new communities, how they keep up with traditions. But it also shows the resilience, it shows the color, it shows the life. And I like a balance of that because a person is not just their trauma, right? The person is also, all the reasons for smiling, all the reasons for working, all the reasons for loving who they are. And you really get that. So I liked that a lot. And I liked that the story really became completely about the great aunt because she's a character. Like, if you like vibrant, strong characters that just like completely take over a page, that great aunt is everything. It's definitely a really difficult story. There are content warnings I would recommend people looking up, especially for mental health situations, because there are some graphic thought processes that certain characters go through about their darker places. So I would definitely look into that because that's also part of how this person has had to cope with their life, cope with the relationship of their parents, cope with how their mother was. Stellar. I really, really enjoyed it. It might have been in contention for favorite of the year. I don't know. Maybe in hindsight it should have been. It's hard for me to say. If I ever see a copy of this in the wild, I would probably buy it. Like, I really enjoyed it that much. Okay, next up is another one I read for the Ursula K. Le Guin, and it actually was on lots of lists for the year, so I just finally got to read it, and that's Some Desperate Glory. This is my first and won't be my last Emily Tesh because I really enjoyed this. This is the story of Valkyr, who has been indoctrinated into this militaristic society. They have to fight this alien race who is bad, and if you've read any military sci-fi, you know that she's not been told everything, that she's been a little brainwashed, etc., right? So you start really tropey. Really, like, of course she's really annoying now. She's gonna grow. But, like, the story goes places you do not anticipate in, like, the best way. It is about deconstruction. That theme of deconstruction is incredibly strong. But how it chooses to approach it, you cannot predict. At least I could not predict. And I don't know. I tend to seem to think that I've read a lot of things. But I was at the halfway point of this book at one point. I'm like, this feels like the climax of a finished story, but I have 200 pages left. And, that was exactly how I felt while watching Everything Everywhere All at Once, where I was like, I feel like I'm at the end of the movie, halfway through the movie. What could happen next? And it's still amazing, right? What happens next? You're just completely unprepared. So I really enjoyed that. And it's just also a great blend of, this is a fun sci-fi story, and it's thematically rich. And you have characters that grow and are easy to root for, even though they are prickly and, like, obnoxious at times. I had a blast. I don't know if I would buy this one if I saw it, because I don't love the cover that much, but you never say never. If it was ever in, like, pristine condition, and when I held it, I was like, oh, this must come home with me, it might. And it's a great standalone. I do not think there are supposed to be any other books in this series, and it completely holds up on its own. Next up is Juniper and Thorn by Ava Reid, another author I need to try out more of her works based off reading this, even though I know she's like a classic, nobody likes all of her books author. Everyone has their favorites that she has written, and from what I can see in my circles, no one likes them all. This is dark. Some people pick it up and they don't like it because they didn't know it was dark. I think this cover screams we're not going to have a good time, but who is to say? I mean, if you read her first book, which I hear is more related to Uprooted, which I also don't think is a very light book, so I don't know. But this is very dark. There is a lot of, I wouldn't say physical domestic abuse, but definitely emotional domestic abuse. There's definitely consent taken away. So we have this mid-20s character, and she's very gullible and naive because she has been so isolated her whole life. And she gets to get out. And it's really amazing watching her love what she sees, loving dance. And it's kind of a historical fantasy. It feels very early 20th century, Eastern European, Russia inspired, but it's not actually set there. And I just got swept away. I loved how lush it was. I loved how the characters interacted. It's a very short book. And in a very short amount of time, I was completely invested in these characters and their new love story and their agenda and their fight for agency. I was incredibly in it. And it was, I love dark fairy tales. This is a great, great, dark, gruesome fairy tale. Okay? Like, Brothers Grimm plus some dark fairy tale. I had a great time. Do I think it'll stay with me forever? No, but like I had a blast. I really did, and I have a new copy that I bought from Half Price Bookstore, and I'm really glad that I have it for my shelves, and I am going to try some of her other stuff and see what works for me. I'm cautiously optimistic because what I liked was the writing style. Like, that's what made me fall into it. And you can kind of tell as I'm talking through this list, it's writing style that always makes me surprised because that's what you can't learn from other people's reviews or from blurbs, is if that author's writing style is going to work with your brain and how you process data, right? And so every time that happens and I'm just like completely swept away, I'm just like, yes, this is amazing. I am so happy. And like this one, I also just had tempered expectations because it had all the mixed reviews, all of them. And my last like surprise, if only because like I just didn't even know this book existed and I read it in a day, was When We Cease to Understand. I think it's When We Cease to Understand the World, maybe. I don't know. It's by a author from Chile. I think it was originally in Spanish and translated to English. And it's kind of my little niche part of the world that I do love thinking about. So when I read Warm Hands of Ghost earlier this year, my friends were like, you should read this, based off all of the blathering I did on explaining why I liked Warm Hands of Ghost, why I have certain opinions about which scientists get highlighted in history from the 20th century, etc. And so this is a nonfiction that takes narrative liberties, okay? But it kind of focuses on scientists and mathematicians in the 20th century and different world events around them, and kind of goes through maybe how certain ideas came to be, such as general relativity and kind of the idea of predicting a black hole before we could see a black hole. Scientists who are both responsible for creating fertilizer and also mustard gas, you know, and what does that mean? Also, a scientist who was responsible for creating the gas that would one day kill his family in concentration camps, you know, like a lot of not separating the science from the history. And I feel like it's always so weird that we do that because science is not created in a vacuum. Ask any scientist who's ever applying for a grant. They are always very stressed by the current political climate. And science has a good way of like working around it sometimes. There was a time period where they couldn't work with stem cells because in the United States, I don't know about other countries, because of certain political stopgaps. And so they learned a new way to make stem cells that wasn't ethically a problem. But there are some things that they couldn't get around. For example, the use of certain recreational drugs do have health implications, but because they are federally illegal, we can't study what those health implications are. So science and the funding of science is incredibly political, cannot be detached from history, and I really love the intersection of those two things. There's a section on this mathematician. The quantum mechanics section was very fun for me, especially because, I mean, I don't know if this is actually true, but there is this whole thing when you learn quantum mechanics, you just kind of learn how to use the equations. Like, you kind of just stare and you're like, how did we get here? Who thought of an eigenvector? Like, how? And it kind of, part of the story's conceit, or maybe thesis, is, you know, sometimes we cease to understand. We don't understand the math, we just know how to use the math. And that made one of the mathematicians, like, very nervous in the story. I don't know if that's in real life. But I had a fun time with it. I was really surprised. I didn't know something like this existed, and I had a blast doing my last end-of-the-year yard work while listening to it. And now we'll get into my 3 runners-up that will not be in my best of the year video, but they were like highlights of the year for me, and I would have been sad if I didn't talk about them. We have 7 Days in June. I finally read this for my friends. We do like kind of a sort of romance book club buddy read. It's very casual. I just really like this. I need to read her new work. Because I think she does a good blending of romance and trauma that I tend to like eat up. Because I do just love healing. I think healing is very cathartic. But this is a second chance romance with flashbacks. It's very heavy material. They were both drug addicts when they were kids together. They're both still recovering from their life circumstances that left them there, and there's this misunderstanding for why their lives got separated. And so when they fall into each other's lives again, you know, they're trying to rebuild things, but they also don't have complete information. And they're both authors, and they both write about each other and became famous in different ways for that. Like, one writes this very pulpy, long-running paranormal romance, and the lead is obviously this guy, and he writes these really hard-hitting contemporaries that are obviously, like, about her and her life experiences. So, yeah, I just really enjoyed it. It is heavy. Look up content warnings, obviously. We have Those Beyond the Wall by Micaiah Johnson. I really liked this because I just really like Micaiah Johnson's writing. I will read anything she puts out. So this is not surprising, but it's like a book I really enjoyed reading. It takes place after The Space Between Worlds. I do think you need to read The Space Between Worlds first. There is a lot of, I think, world building that's assumed that you know from reading the first book, and there is enough of the characters from the first book that I don't think it's just a companion novel. But we are primarily focused on the outside of the domed city, and our main characters are not the main characters from the first book. And we're dealing with a situation where people are randomly dying, and then also just always this cultural tension between Ashtown and the domed city, and how do we rectify that? And I really loved the cultural world building. I loved getting to see Ashtown. I loved getting to interrogate a way of rehabilitation that we don't usually lean into. I really liked that our main character is kind of not a great person. Like, she's not. And I like watching her deal with that. And I don't know, not necessarily grow into a new person, but kind of taking that at face value, which is kind of like also what you kind of do with Ashtown. And like it's basically just challenging you to, you know, go, well, just because they're not my favorite person, does that mean that all of this is okay? And the answer is no. So I really liked that science fiction. I wish it got more love, truly. And then Sorceress Comes to Call by T. Kingfisher. I actually have a different T. Kingfisher in my best of the year, because I've read a lot of her last year. But this one is probably, it's not quite my favorite dark fairy tale by her, but like, it's a good one. It really is. She does two of like her best character tropes here. She writes very good gullible characters, and she writes really good middle-aged old ladies, and we got both of them. And they're great. It's dark. There was a moment where I was like, what? Nope. And I put down the book. And I'm like, that did not just happen. How did that just happen? So she goes there. It's not a happy-go-lucky good time, but it's going to trick you because it's T. Kingfisher, and you read it and you're like, this is cozy. This is nice. And then you're like, we can do that in a cozy book, and you can in a T. Kingfisher book. So, yeah, it's great. I hear it's a retelling of The Goose Girl. I've never read The Goose Girl, so I can't tell you if it's good or bad interpretation of that. And the acknowledgments is funny. Highly recommend reading the acknowledgments if you're someone who skips those. I think T. Kingfisher just, she's a fun person to follow. Like, she just has fun thoughts, and I just like listening to them, and I think she's funny. And yeah, so this was not surprising that I liked it, but it just wasn't quite in favorite of the year territory. So yeah, these are my surprises and runner-ups. Next video will be my favorites, and I don't care that I haven't finished Wind and Truth. So don't come at me. Don't do it. Don't do it. If you just want to leave an emoji to let me know you're here. Ooh, I don't know. What was my biggest surprise? It was probably translation state, but I don't know what emoji to give for that. Let's just do space. A space emoji. Because there are a lot of space-related things here. And otherwise, like if you liked it, subscribe if you want to, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.